They called me a startup casualty while carving the turkey, laughing like my dreams were the punchline to their perfect Thanksgiving joke. What they didn't know was that I'd been quietly building something they couldn't even comprehend. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and from wherever you're watching this, you need to hear what happened next. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Have you ever walked into a room and felt the air shift, like everyone had been talking about you just seconds before? That's exactly what happened when I stepped into my parents' colonial home in Westchester County that Thursday afternoon. The smell of sage and roasted chestnuts should have felt welcoming, but instead, it felt like walking into an ambush disguised as tradition. I'd driven 4 hours from Boston, my Honda Civic packed with homemade cranberry sauce and the kind of nervous energy that comes from knowing you're about to face a jury that's already decided your guilt. My family had perfected the art of making me feel like an outsider at my own homecoming, and Thanksgiving 2024 was about to become their masterpiece. My older brother Marcus was already there, naturally. He'd flown in from Chicago the night before. His BMW rental car parked prominently in the circular driveway like a monument to his success as a corporate lawyer. His wife Jennifer sat perched on the antique sofa, her Hermes bag casually placed where everyone could see the label, scrolling through photos of their recent trip to Napa Valley. Sarah, my mother, Patricia Mitchell, called from the kitchen, her voice carrying that particular tone she reserved for addressing disappointments. We weren't sure you'd make it. I know how busy you've been with your little project. Little project. That's what she called the company I'd been building for the past 3 years. The company that had consumed every waking moment, every dollar of my savings, every ounce of faith I had left in myself. To her, it was just another phase, like when I'd wanted to be a marine biologist in middle school, or when I'd briefly considered law school before realizing I couldn't stomach following in Marcus's footsteps. My father, Richard Mitchell, barely looked up from his newspaper when I entered the living room. He'd always been a man of few words, preferring to let his disapproval speak through strategic silence and the occasional sharp comment designed to cut deep and heal slow. Today, he wore his disappointment like a well-tailored suit, perfectly fitted and impossible to ignore. "How's the unemployment treating you?" Marcus asked with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. He'd always had this talent for disguising cruelty as concern, wrapping his barbs in just enough plausible deniability that calling him out would make me look oversensitive. "I'm not unemployed," I replied, setting my purse down carefully, already feeling the familiar weight of having to justify my existence. "I'm running my own company." Jennifer looked up from her phone with the kind of smile people reserve for children who insist they're going to marry their kindergarten teacher. "Oh, that's so cute. What do you call it again? Some kind of app thing?" It wasn't some kind of app thing. It was NutriBridge, a platform I'd developed that used AI to create personalized nutrition plans for people with chronic health conditions. I'd spent months researching the intersection of technology and healthcare, interviewing doctors, nutritionists, and patients. I'd taught myself coding, studied market analysis until my eyes burned, and pitched to investors who either didn't understand the vision or couldn't see past my lack of traditional credentials. But explaining that to Jennifer felt like trying to describe color to someone who'd never seen light. She lived in a world where success was measured in designer labels and country club memberships, where anything that couldn't be easily categorized was automatically dismissed as frivolous. "It's a health tech platform," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the familiar burn of frustration rising in my chest. "We're working on partnerships with several major medical centers." "Working on," my father repeated, finally lowering his newspaper to fix me with the kind of stare that had made me feel small since childhood. "That's not the same as having, is it, Sarah? The thing about family is that they know exactly where to press to make you bleed. They've had years to map your vulnerabilities, to catalog every insecurity and self-doubt. My father had always been particularly skilled at this. able to reduce my biggest dreams to their smallest components with surgical precision. Dad, building a company takes time, I said, hating how defensive I sounded even to my own ears. We're in the scaling phase and… Scaling phase, Marcus interrupted with a laugh that sounded more like a bark. Is that what we're calling it when nobody wants to invest in your idea? The words hit like a physical blow. He wasn't wrong. I'd been turned down by 17 different investment firms in the past 6 months. Each rejection had felt like a small death, a confirmation of every doubt my family had ever planted in my mind. But what Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd finally found something that changed everything. 2 weeks ago, I'd received an email that had made my hands shake as I read it. Dr. Elena Rodriguez from Stanford Medical Center had been using NutriBridge in a pilot program with 50 of her patients with type 2 diabetes. The results were remarkable. Better than anything she'd seen with traditional dietary counseling. She wanted to expand the program and had connected me with her colleague at Johns Hopkins, who was interested in a similar trial for patients with autoimmune conditions. But more importantly, Dr. Rodriguez had mentioned my work to someone at a conference. Someone who worked for Meridian Health Systems, one of the largest healthcare networks in the country. Someone who was very interested in discussing acquisition possibilities. I'd been in talks with their development team for the past 10 days, exchanging technical documentation, market analysis, and financial projections. The preliminary numbers they'd mentioned had made me dizzy with possibility, but I hadn't told anyone. Not yet. The deal was still in early stages, and I'd learned the hard way that hope shared too early with my family became ammunition for their doubt. You know, my mother said, appearing in the doorway with a dish towel draped over her shoulder like a badge of domestic authority. It's not too late to go back to school. Get a teaching certificate, maybe. Something stable. Something real. Something real. As if the hundreds of hours I'd poured into research and development were imaginary. As if the patients who'd already started seeing improvements using my platform were fictional. As if the sleepless nights, the financial sacrifices, the constant battle against imposter syndrome were all just elaborate theater. I don't want to be a teacher, Mom, I said, the words coming out sharper than I'd intended. I want to build something that actually helps people. Well, of course, sweetheart, she said with that patronizing smile that had haunted my childhood. But helping people doesn't always pay the bills, does it? And you're not getting any younger. You're 32, Sarah. Don't you think it's time to be practical? Practical. That word had been following me around like a shadow since college. Be practical, Sarah. Don't dream so big, Sarah. Know your limitations, Sarah. Every time I'd reached for something beyond their narrow definition of acceptable success, I'd been reminded to be practical. But what they called impractical, I called necessary. Healthcare in America was broken, and I'd seen it firsthand when my college roommate Lisa had struggled to manage her lupus. The generic dietary advice from her doctors hadn't worked, and the nutritionists were too expensive for her graduate student budget. I'd watched brilliant, capable people like Lisa fall through the cracks of a system that treated them like statistics instead of individuals. That's what had inspired NutriBridge in the first place, the belief that technology could bridge the gap between one-size-fits-all medical advice and personalized care that actually worked. It wasn't just a business idea, it was a mission born from watching people I cared about suffer unnecessarily. You know what I think? Jennifer chimed in, clearly feeling emboldened by the supportive audience. I think it's wonderful that Sarah is following her passion. Even if it doesn't work out, at least she'll know she tried. Even if it doesn't work out. The casual dismissal stung more than outright mockery would have. She was already writing my obituary, packaging my failure in the kind of hollow encouragement. That felt like a consolation prize for the terminally naive. Maybe she could write a book about it, Marcus suggested, his grin widening. You know, how I learned to stop worrying and love my trust fund. might actually make some money trust fund. That was the nuclear option. The accusation designed to invalidate every struggle, every sleepless night, every ramen dinner I'd eaten while bootstrapping my company. Yes, our family had money. Yes, I could have taken the easy path, accepted a position at one of my father's connections, lived comfortably on family wealth and expectations. But I'd chosen the hard way specifically because I wanted to build something that was mine. I'd worked 3 part-time jobs through college, lived in a studio apartment that was barely bigger than my childhood walk-in closet, and turned down countless offers of financial help because I needed to prove, to myself more than anyone, that I could succeed on my own terms. "I haven't touched the trust fund," I said quietly, my voice carrying a warning they were all too self-absorbed to hear. "Everything I've built myself." "Well, that's admirable, dear," my mother said, but her tone suggested she found it more puzzling than praiseworthy. "But surely you can see how this looks from the outside. 3 years, and what do you have to show for it? A website that nobody uses and a bank account that gets smaller every month." The accuracy of that last part felt like a knife between my ribs. She wasn't wrong about my financial situation. I'd been living on savings and credit cards for months, pouring every penny back into development and marketing. My apartment in Boston was a far cry from the comfortable suburban home I'd grown up in, and my wardrobe consisted primarily of thrift store finds and promotional t-shirts from tech conferences. But what they couldn't see, what they refused to acknowledge, was that I was closer to success than I'd ever been. The Meridian deal alone could change everything, validating not just my business model, but every sacrifice I'd made along the way. In just a few more weeks, I might be able to prove that their practical daughter had been impractically right all along. "Dinner's ready," my mother announced, as if she hadn't just spent the last 10 minutes systematically dismantling my self-worth. "Sarah, would you mind helping carry the dishes? Since you're between projects right now." Between projects. Another carefully chosen phrase designed to minimize and diminish. I wasn't between anything. I was in the middle of the most important work of my life. But as I followed her into the dining room, carrying a casserole dish that probably cost more than my monthly groceries, I felt that familiar childhood sensation of shrinking, of becoming smaller and smaller until I might disappear entirely. The dining room was set with my mother's finest china, the Waterford crystal that only appeared for holidays, and the occasional visit from important clients. Everything gleamed under the chandelier, perfect and pristine and utterly intimidating. This was the stage where our family performed its annual ritual of gratitude, where we pretended to be thankful for blessings while expertly cataloging each other's shortcomings. As we settled into our assigned seats, me at the far end of the table naturally, I couldn't help but notice how the seating arrangement told its own story. Marcus sat at my father's right hand, the heir apparent to the family's expectations. Jennifer beside him, beautiful and accomplished and everything a daughter-in-law should be. My parents anchored either end of the table like bookends of disappointment. And me? I was relegated to the corner, close enough to participate, but far enough away to be easily ignored. It was a metaphor for my entire relationship with this family. Always present, but never quite belonging. Always trying to earn a seat at a table, where my value had been predetermined and found wanting. But as I unfolded my napkin and prepared for what I knew would be a long and painful evening, I had no idea that everything was about to change. Hidden in my purse, my phone was already buzzing with missed calls and urgent emails that would transform this nightmare into the best thing that had ever happened to me. I just didn't know it yet. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The turkey sat golden and perfect in the center of the table, surrounded by all the traditional fixings that made my mother's Thanksgiving spread look like something from a magazine. But the atmosphere felt more like a courtroom than a celebration, with me cast as the defendant in a trial I hadn't realized I was attending. "So, Sarah, my father began as he carved the turkey with surgical precision, each slice falling perfectly onto the serving platter. Your mother and I have been talking. We think it might be time for you to consider your options. Options. In family speak, that meant admitting defeat and accepting whatever safe, soul-crushing alternative they'd already selected for me. I took a sip of wine, trying to buy myself a moment to formulate a response that wouldn't end in a screaming match. What kind of options? I asked, though I already dreaded the answer. Well, my mother interjected, passing the mashed potatoes with the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. Patricia Henderson from the country club mentioned that Whitmore Academy is looking for a new computer science teacher. It's not exactly what you've been doing, but at least it would use some of your technical background. Patricia Henderson. I remembered her from countless childhood events, the kind of woman who measured success by the thread count of her tablecloths and the prestige of her children's colleges. The fact that my mother had been discussing my career prospects with her felt like the ultimate betrayal, airing my failures in front of the social circle that had watched me grow up. I'm not looking for a teaching job, I said firmly. NutriBridge is gaining traction. We're in talks with several major healthcare systems and— Talks, Marcus interrupted, loading his plate with enough food to feed a small country. Always talks with you, Sarah. When was the last time you had an actual contract? An actual paycheck? The question hung in the air like smoke from a doused fire, acrid and impossible to ignore. He wasn't wrong about the paycheck part. I'd been living off my savings for months, supplementing with freelance web design work when absolutely necessary. But what he didn't understand was that building something revolutionary required sacrifice. Every successful entrepreneur had a story about eating ramen and sleeping on couches before their breakthrough moment. Building a startup isn't like getting a traditional job, Marcus, I explained, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. There's an investment phase where you're developing the product, building partnerships, proving market fit. It's not about immediate gratification. Investment phase, Jennifer repeated with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. Is that what we're calling burning through your inheritance? I felt my face flush hot. I haven't touched my inheritance. I told you, everything I've done has been self-funded. Yes, we know, my father said, his tone suggesting he found my independence more foolish than admirable. But Sarah, you're 32 years old. You can't keep playing entrepreneur forever. At some point, you need to face reality. Reality. Another one of their favorite weapons, wielded whenever I dared to dream beyond their narrow definition of acceptable achievement. But what they called reality felt more like surrender. Giving up on the thing that made me feel most alive in exchange for the kind of safety that slowly suffocated your soul. You know what I think the problem is? Marcus continued, clearly, warming to his theme. You've been living in this bubble where everyone tells you how innovative and brilliant you are, but you've never had to actually compete in the real world. You've never had to answer to a boss, meet quarterly targets, deal with actual consequences. The accusation stung because it contained just enough truth to hurt. I had been working independently for years, answerable only to myself and my vision. But that didn't make my work less valid, or my struggles less real. If anything, it made them more challenging. I didn't have the safety net of a corporate structure, or the luxury of shifting blame when things went wrong. I've been running my own business for 3 years, I shot back. I've had to learn everything from coding to marketing to financial planning. I've had to pitch investors, negotiate contracts, manage budgets. How is that not real-world experience? Because none of it has actually worked, my mother said gently, as if her words weren't designed to cut me down at the knees. Sweetheart, I know you've been trying so hard, but sometimes trying isn't enough. Sometimes we have to accept that maybe we're just better suited for different things. Different things. Code for smaller things, safer things, Things that wouldn't embarrass them at dinner parties when their friends asked about their daughter's career. They wanted me to be content with mediocrity, to accept that dreaming big was a luxury they couldn't afford to support, even emotionally. "You remember Tommy Brennan?" my father asked, cutting himself another piece of turkey. "Patricia's youngest son? He started some kind of tech company right out of college, too. Burned through $200,000 of his parents' money before he finally gave up and went to work for Goldman Sachs. Now he's doing very well for himself. Bought a house in Greenwich. Married that lovely girl from Darien." The comparison to Tommy Brennan was particularly cruel because everyone knew his story had ended in spectacular failure. His company had been featured in TechCrunch as one of the biggest startup disasters of 2019, a cautionary tale about inexperienced founders with more money than sense. The fact that my father was using him as an example of someone who'd found success by giving up felt like a direct attack on everything I'd been working toward. "Tommy's company failed because he had no clear vision and no understanding of his market," I said, my voice rising slightly despite my efforts to stay calm. "NutriBridge is different. We're solving a real problem with proven technology. We have early adopters showing measurable results." "Early adopters," Marcus repeated with that same condescending smile. "How many early adopters are we talking about here? 10? 20? The actual number was 47 active users, with another 132 who had completed the initial assessment but hadn't fully engaged with the platform. Not huge numbers by Silicon Valley standards, but solid proof of concept for a bootstrap startup still in development phase. But I knew that explaining the nuances of user acquisition and engagement metrics would only give them more ammunition to use against me. "The important thing isn't the current user base," I said, choosing my words carefully. "It's the validation from medical professionals and the potential for scalability." "Potential," Jennifer chimed in, having clearly decided that piling on was the evening's entertainment. "That's another one of those startup words that means nothing, isn't it? Like pivoting and disrupting and all those other buzzwords you use to avoid admitting failure." The casual dismissal of language that represented years of learning and growth felt like being slapped by someone who'd never bothered to understand what I was actually doing. These weren't buzzwords to me. They were precise terms that described real business concepts, strategies I'd studied and implemented with careful consideration. "You know what I find interesting?" my mother said, refilling her wine glass with the kind of deliberate slowness that signaled she was building toward something particularly cutting. "All these years, all this talk about helping people and changing healthcare, but have you actually helped anyone? I mean, genuinely helped someone in a way that made their life better?" The question hit me like a physical blow because it struck at the core of my deepest insecurity. Was I actually making a difference? Or was I just another delusional entrepreneur convinced of my own importance? The doubt that question planted began to grow immediately, spreading through my chest like poison. But then I thought about Maria Santos, a 54-year-old woman from Phoenix who'd been struggling with rheumatoid arthritis for over a decade. She'd found NutriBridge through a support group forum and had been using the platform for 6 months. Last week, she'd sent me an email describing how the personalized anti-inflammatory meal plans had reduced her joint pain more than any medication she'd tried. She'd included a photo of herself hiking with her grandchildren for the first time in years. I thought about David Chen, a college student with Crohn's disease who'd been using the platform to identify trigger foods and optimize his nutrition around his class schedule. His flare-ups had decreased by 60%, and he'd been able to stay in school instead of dropping out like he'd planned. I thought about dozens of other users who'd taken the time to send feedback, testimonials, and success stories. People who'd found hope and healing through something I'd built from nothing, working 16-hour days in my tiny apartment. "Yes," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the emotion building in my throat. "I have helped people, more than you might think." "Oh, sweetie," my mother said with that particular tone of pity that had haunted my childhood. "I'm sure you think you have." But feeling like you're helping and actually making a meaningful difference are two very different things. The conversation continued to spiral downward from there, each family member taking turns to dissect my choices, my character, and my prospects, with the kind of surgical precision that only comes from years of practice. They questioned my business model, my technical skills, my understanding of the market. They wondered aloud whether I was simply too stubborn to admit failure, too proud to accept help, too naive to understand how the world really worked. Every achievement I mentioned was minimized. Every struggle was attributed to poor planning or unrealistic expectations. They painted a picture of me as a perpetual child, playing dress-up in the grown-up world of business, while more sensible people got on with the serious work of living. As the meal progressed, I found myself retreating into silence, mechanically, eating food that tasted like sawdust while they continued their character assassination disguised as concern. My phone buzzed occasionally in my purse, but I ignored it, too emotionally battered to deal with whatever crisis or opportunity might be waiting for my attention. What I didn't know was that those buzzing notifications weren't just routine emails or spam calls. They were 17 different attempts to reach me from legal offices, investment firms, and corporate development teams, all trying to deliver news that would fundamentally change everything about this conversation. But for now, I sat at the end of that perfectly set table, surrounded by people who shared my DNA but not my dreams, wondering if maybe they were right. Maybe I was delusional. Maybe I was wasting my life chasing something that would never materialize. Maybe it was time to accept defeat and find a nice, safe teaching job where I could spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. At the exact moment when I was closest to vindication, I was also closest to giving up entirely. Sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of timing, and this Thanksgiving was about to become proof that the darkest hour really does come just before dawn. But I had no way of knowing that yet. All I knew was that the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had spent the entire evening systematically destroying every shred of confidence I'd managed to build over the past 3 years. And the worst part? Part of me was starting to believe they might be right. The pumpkin pie sat untouched on my plate as my family continued their systematic demolition of everything I'd built my life around. The conversation had moved from questioning my business, acumen to dissecting my character, and I felt like a specimen under a microscope, every flaw magnified and cataloged for public examination. "I just think," my mother was saying, carefully cutting her pie into precise geometric pieces, "that maybe this whole entrepreneurship phase has been Sarah's way of avoiding real responsibility. It's easier to blame external factors when your made-up job doesn't work out than to acknowledge you might not be cut out for something." Made-up job. The phrase hit me like a slap across the face. 3 years of 18-hour days, of learning programming languages that made my brain hurt, of cold-calling medical professionals who hung up on me, of presenting to investors who looked through me like I was invisible. All of it reduced to a made-up job by the woman who'd given birth to me. "It's not a made-up job, Mom," I said, my voice barely above a whisper because I was afraid that speaking louder would release the scream building in my chest. "I have a product. I have users. I have revenue." "Revenue," Marcus scoffed, leaning back in his chair with the satisfied posture of someone who'd won an argument before it started. "What kind of revenue are we talking about here? Because last I checked, your LinkedIn still said, 'seeking investment opportunities,' which is code for unemployed but too proud to admit it." The fact that he'd been stalking my LinkedIn profile felt like another violation, another way they'd been monitoring my failures from a distance so they could weaponize them during family gatherings. I'd updated that status months ago when I was actively fundraising, but I'd been too busy with product development to change it since the Meridian conversations began. "I'm not seeking investment anymore," I said, and immediately regretted revealing that information because I knew they'd find a way to twist it against me. "Oh, you gave up on that too?" Jennifer asked with mock sympathy. "I suppose that makes sense. Investors probably want to see actual results before they hand over money to someone with no business background. No business background. Another carefully aimed arrow designed to hit my most vulnerable spot. It was true that I didn't have an MBA or experience working for Fortune 500 companies. My background was in biomedical engineering, with a focus on data analysis and systems design. I'd transitioned into entrepreneurship because I'd seen a problem that needed solving, and I had the technical skills to build a solution. But to them, my unconventional path was evidence of incompetence rather than innovation. They couldn't conceive of success that didn't follow their predetermined template of college, corporate job, steady climb up someone else's ladder until you earned the right to make decisions for yourself. "You know what your problem is, Sarah," my father said, setting down his fork with the kind of deliberate precision that meant he was about to deliver what he considered the final verdict. "You've never learned to fail gracefully. Every successful person knows when to cut their losses and move on to something more realistic. But you just keep throwing good money after bad, chasing this fantasy that you're going to revolutionize healthcare from your apartment." Throwing good money after bad. The phrase stung because it reduced every sacrifice I'd made to a gambling addiction, every calculated risk to reckless stupidity. But what hurt more was the underlying message, that my dreams were inherently worthless, that any investment in my vision was money wasted. "It's not a fantasy," I said, my voice starting to crack despite my efforts to stay composed. "I have medical professionals using my platform. I have patients seeing real improvements in their health outcomes. I have data proving that personalized nutrition can be more effective than traditional dietary counseling." "Data from 47 users," Marcus said, and my blood ran cold. How could he possibly know that number? I'd never shared specific user statistics with anyone in my family. "How do you know that?" I asked, my voice sharp with suspicion and hurt. He shrugged with the casual cruelty of someone who'd just revealed he'd been investigating me. "I have a friend who works in tech. Asked him to look into your little app, just to see what you were actually doing." Turns out it's not hard to find information when someone's not exactly setting the world on fire. The betrayal felt like a physical wound. He'd been researching me, digging into my business, treating me like a potential fraud case rather than his sister. The violation of privacy was bad enough, but the fact that he'd done it so he could humiliate me more effectively at Thanksgiving dinner was almost unbearable. "You investigated me?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "I looked out for you," he corrected, as if his stalking was somehow protective. And what I found was concerning. 47 active users after 3 years? "Sarah, that's not a business. That's a hobby. A very expensive hobby that's preventing you from building a real career." The numbers felt damning when stripped of context. When presented without the story of growth, the challenges of breaking into healthcare markets, the complexity of building trust with medical professionals. 47 users sounded pathetic when you didn't mention that they'd come through word-of-mouth referrals, that each one represented hours of personal consultation and customization, that the retention rate was over 80% because people were actually getting results. Those 47 users have seen an average improvement of 63% in their condition management, I said, my voice growing stronger as I thought about the real people behind the numbers. They've reduced medication dependence, improved quality of life, avoided hospitalizations. But I guess that doesn't matter if it's not profitable enough for your standards. "Of course it matters," my mother said with that patronizing tone that made me feel like I was 12 years old again. "But sweetie, you can't save the world one person at a time. It's just not sustainable. And more importantly, it's not fair to yourself. You're spending the best years of your life on something that's never going to provide the security you need." Security. The golden idol they worshipped above all else. The false god that demanded the sacrifice of dreams in exchange for the promise of comfort. They couldn't understand that some things were worth more than security, that the chance to build something meaningful was worth the risk of failure. "What if I don't want security?" I asked, my voice rising for the first time all evening. What if I want to build something that matters more than my comfort level? Then you're being selfish, my father said bluntly, because your choices don't just affect you, Sarah. They affect this family. Do you think it's easy for us to watch you struggle? Do you think we enjoy telling our friends that our daughter is still figuring things out at 32? There it was, the real issue. This wasn't about my happiness or my success or my potential to make a difference in the world. This was about their embarrassment at having a daughter who didn't fit their narrative of family achievement. I was a stain on their reputation, a conversation they had to navigate awkwardly at cocktail parties and charity events. I'm sorry, my life choices are inconvenient for your social calendar, I said, standing up from the table so abruptly that my chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. But I'm not living my life to make you look good to the country club. Sarah, sit down, my mother commanded in the voice she'd used to control me throughout childhood. We're not finished discussing this. But I was finished. I was finished. Being dissected and dismissed and diminished by people who claimed to love me, but seemed determined to destroy every ounce of confidence I'd managed to build. I was finished being the family disappointment, the cautionary tale they'd used to teach other people's children about the dangers of dreaming too big. Actually, we are finished, I said, reaching for my purse with hands that shook slightly from adrenaline and suppressed rage. Because I'm done trying to explain my life to people who've already decided I'm a failure. Don't be dramatic, Marcus said, but I could hear a note of uncertainty in his voice, as if he was beginning to realize they might have pushed too far this time. Dramatic? I laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. You want to see dramatic? Dramatic would be me staying here and letting you continue to tear apart everything I've worked for. Dramatic would be me sitting through dessert while you plan my surrender to mediocrity. This is just self-preservation. I slung my purse over my shoulder and headed toward the front door, my heels clicking against the marble foyer floor with the sharp staccato rhythm of someone who'd made an irreversible decision. Sarah, don't you dare walk out of this house, my father called after me, his voice carrying the kind of authority that had worked when I was 16, but had no power over the woman I'd become. Watch me, I called back, not bothering to turn around. If you leave now, don't expect us to be here when you finally come to your senses, my mother shouted from the dining room, her voice cracking with what might have been genuine emotion, or might have been wounded pride. I stopped with my hand on the front door handle, my back still turned to them, and for a moment, I considered going back. Not to apologize or capitulate, but to try one more time to make them understand who I really was and what I was really trying to build. But then I remembered the look in Marcus's eyes when he'd revealed he'd been investigating me. The casual cruelty of reducing my users to numbers, the systematic way they'd spent the entire evening destroying my confidence. These weren't people who were capable of seeing me clearly, no matter how many times I tried to explain. You know what? I said, turning the handle and feeling the cool November air rush in from outside. Maybe that's exactly what I need. I walked out into the night, leaving behind the warm glow of their perfect house and their perfectly orchestrated disappointment. My car felt like a sanctuary, and I sat in the driveway for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel as I tried to process what had just happened. I'd finally done it. I'd finally walked away from the table where I was always served scraps of acceptance and asked to be grateful for the privilege. I'd finally stopped begging for approval from people who seemed incapable of giving it. As I drove away from their house, my phone buzzed again from inside my purse. I ignored it, just like I'd been ignoring the calls and texts all evening. I was too emotionally raw to deal with whatever crisis or opportunity might be waiting for my attention. But those missed notifications weren't random interruptions. They were 17 different attempts to reach me with news that would prove every assumption my family had made about my failure was spectacularly wrong. The universe was trying to deliver my vindication, but I was too heartbroken to answer the phone. Sometimes the most important calls come at the worst possible moments, And sometimes the biggest victories arrive disguised as the deepest defeats. I was about to learn that the night I walked away from my family was also the night everything I'd been working toward finally came together. But for now, all I knew was that I was driving home alone on Thanksgiving night, wondering if I'd just burned the only bridges I had left in the world. I drove through the empty Boston streets in a fog of emotional exhaustion, the city looking alien and unwelcoming under the orange glow of streetlights. Thanksgiving night meant most people were home with their families, sharing dessert and making plans for Black Friday shopping, not fleeing from dinner tables like refugees from their own bloodlines. My studio apartment in Jamaica Plain felt like a sanctuary when I finally climbed the 3 flights of stairs to my door. The familiar smell of my neighbors cooking and the distant sound of music from the apartment below were oddly comforting after the sterile perfection of my parents' house. This place might be small and imperfect, but at least it was mine. I kicked off my heels and sank onto my secondhand couch, finally allowing myself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. I'd burned bridges tonight that could never be rebuilt. I'd walked away from the only family I had, and for what? Pride? Principle? The stubborn refusal to admit that maybe they were right about my delusions of grandeur? The rational part of my brain, the part that sounded suspiciously like my father's voice, whispered that I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life, that I'd thrown away decades of relationships for the sake of defending a business that barely existed, that I'd chosen my ego over my family and now I was truly alone. But another part of me, buried deeper but growing stronger, felt something I hadn't experienced in years: relief. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't pretending to be smaller than I was to make other people comfortable. I wasn't apologizing for my ambitions or justifying my dreams to people who'd already decided they were worthless. I changed into my pajamas and made myself a cup of tea, going through the motions of self-care while my mind replayed every cutting word, every dismissive gesture, every moment when I should have defended myself more forcefully. The apartment felt impossibly quiet after the chaos of the evening, and I found myself missing the familiar weight of my phone buzzing with notifications. My phone. I'd been ignoring it all evening, too emotionally overwhelmed to deal with whatever demands might be waiting for my attention. Now, sitting in the silence of my apartment, I realized I should probably check for any urgent messages from clients or platform users who might need support. I pulled my phone from my purse and my heart nearly stopped. 17 missed calls, 23 unread text messages, 41 emails marked urgent. The notification screen was so crowded with alerts that I had to scroll to see them all. My first thought was that something had gone catastrophically wrong with the platform. Maybe there was a security breach or a critical bug that was causing user data to be compromised. My hands shook as I started scrolling through the messages, bracing myself for whatever crisis would cap off this already devastating day. But the first voicemail wasn't from a panicked user or an angry client. It was from a number I didn't recognize, with a 202 area code that made my pulse quicken. Washington, D.C. Ms. Mitchell, this is Amanda Chen from Hartfield, Morrison & Associates. We represent Meridian Health Systems in their acquisition negotiations. We've been trying to reach you all evening regarding an urgent development in your discussions. Please call me back immediately, regardless of the time. This is extremely time-sensitive. I stared at the phone, my brain struggling to process what I'd just heard. Meridian Health Systems, the healthcare giant I'd been in preliminary talks with about potential acquisition of NutriBridge. But those conversations had been casual, exploratory at best. Nothing that would require urgent legal representation or time-sensitive negotiations. The second voicemail was from Dr. Elena Rodriguez at Stanford, her usually calm voice tight with excitement. Sarah, I don't know if you've heard yet, but the preliminary results from our extended trial are extraordinary, beyond extraordinary. The FDA Fast Track Program Coordinator wants to speak with you directly about accelerated approval for clinical applications. I've never seen anything like this, In 30 years of practice, call me. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely navigate to the third message. This one was from a number with a 212 area code, New York. Ms. Mitchell, this is Robert Steinberg from Goldman Sachs Healthcare Investment Division. We understand you're in acquisition talks with Meridian Health, but we'd like to present an alternative proposal that I think you'll find extremely compelling. Our initial valuation analysis suggests your platform could be worth significantly more than current offers on the table. Please call at your earliest convenience. Worth significantly more than current offers. But there were no current offers. I'd had exactly 2 preliminary conversations with Meridian's development team, both focused on technical due diligence rather than financial terms. Whatever was happening, it was moving far beyond anything I'd anticipated. The fourth message made my legs give out entirely, and I collapsed onto my couch as a voice I didn't recognize delivered news that seemed impossible. Ms. Mitchell, this is David Park from the Office of the Surgeon General. We've been reviewing the clinical data from your platform's implementation at Stanford Medical Center and Johns Hopkins. The preliminary results are remarkable, and we'd like to discuss potential partnership opportunities for national implementation. The Surgeon General would like to schedule a call with you personally to discuss how NutriBridge might fit into the Federal Healthcare Modernization Initiative. The Surgeon General. The federal government wanted to talk to me about my hobby, my made-up job, my platform that had supposedly helped only 47 people. I scrolled through message after message, each one more surreal than the last. A venture capital firm in Silicon Valley wanted to lead a Series A funding round. A medical device company was interested in licensing my AI algorithms. The European Union's Health Technology Assessment Board had somehow learned about my work and wanted to explore implementation across member countries. But the message that made me literally drop my phone came from a law firm in Manhattan. Ms. Mitchell, we represent several parties interested in your intellectual property and platform technology. Based on initial valuations from multiple sources, we're prepared to discuss immediate acquisition offers ranging from $12 to $45 million, depending on the structure of the deal. Time is critical as multiple parties are moving. Quickly. Please contact us immediately. $12 to $45 million. For the platform, my family had just spent 4 hours tearing apart as a worthless fantasy. For the business, they'd told me to abandon in favor of a teaching job at a local academy. I sat in stunned silence, scrolling through email after email, from law firms, investment banks, healthcare systems, and government agencies. Each message painted a picture of success beyond my wildest dreams, of validation beyond anything I'd dared to hope for. The technical reports attached to several emails told the story of what had happened while I was enduring my family's character assassination. The expanded trial at Stanford hadn't just been successful, it had been revolutionary. Patients using NutriBridge had shown improvement rates that exceeded anything in the medical literature. The AI-driven personalization algorithms I'd developed had proven more effective than traditional nutritional counseling by margins that seemed almost impossible. Dr. Rodriguez's full report, attached to one of her emails, included data that made my hands shake as I read it. Average improvement in biomarkers, 73%. Reduction in symptoms, 81%. Patient satisfaction scores, 94%. Cost savings compared to traditional treatment, 67%. But the most remarkable finding was something I'd never even thought to measure: quality of life improvements. Patients weren't just getting physically healthier, they were reporting increased energy, better sleep, improved mood, and a sense of control over their health that they'd never experienced before. The Johns Hopkins trial had yielded similar results with a different patient population. The Mayo Clinic had reached out to request participation in a multi-center study. The Cleveland Clinic wanted to license the technology for their entire nutrition department. Everything I'd dreamed of when I first started building NutriBridge was happening simultaneously, like a dam bursting after years of steady pressure. The medical community hadn't just noticed my work, they were racing to be part of it. And somewhere in Westchester County, my family was probably finishing their pumpkin pie and discussing how disappointed they were in my dramatic exit from dinner. They had no idea that while they were cataloging my failures, the world was recognizing my success in ways I'd never imagined possible. The irony was so profound it felt like something from a novel. On the night my family told me to give up on my dreams, those dreams were becoming reality beyond anything I'd dared to imagine. I found myself laughing, not from humor, but from the sheer absurdity of the timing. Hours ago, I'd been sitting at their dinner table wondering if maybe they were right, maybe I was delusional, maybe it was time to accept that I'd wasted 3 years chasing an impossible goal. Now I was holding phone messages from some of the most powerful people in healthcare and technology, all wanting to partner with the woman my family had just dismissed as a failure. The next few hours passed in a blur of returned phone calls, hastily arranged video conferences with lawyers and investors, and increasingly complex discussions about valuations, deal structures, and implementation timelines. By 3 a.m., I had 3 different acquisition offers on the table, 2 licensing agreements under negotiation, and a meeting scheduled with federal health officials for the following week. But the moment that crystallized everything came in a text message I received at 3:47 a.m. from Dr. Rodriguez. Sarah, I just got off a call with colleagues at Harvard, Emory, and UCSF. They all want in on the next phase of trials. What you've built isn't just a business, it's a paradigm shift. You're going to change how we think about personalized medicine. A paradigm shift. Not a hobby, not a made-up job, not a fantasy that was preventing me from accepting reality. A paradigm shift that was going to change healthcare for millions of people. I set my phone down and looked around my tiny apartment, the same space my family had implicitly mocked as evidence of my failure to launch into real adulthood. But this apartment had been my laboratory, my headquarters, my sanctuary, while I built something that apparently mattered more than I'd ever realized. The morning light was starting to filter through my windows, and I realized I hadn't slept at all. But I wasn't tired. I was energized by the recognition that everything I'd sacrificed, every moment of doubt I'd endured, every family dinner where I'd been made to feel small and inadequate, all of it had been leading to this moment. I thought about my family, probably waking up in their perfect house, maybe feeling a little guilty about how harshly they'd treated me the night before, but mostly likely planning how they'd welcome me back when I inevitably came crawling home with my tail between my legs, ready to admit they'd been right all along. They had no idea that their daughter, the family disappointment, was about to become the family success story they'd never seen coming. And honestly, I wasn't sure I was ready to share that victory with people who'd worked so hard to convince me it was impossible. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp November clarity that made everything seem possible. I'd managed exactly 90 minutes of sleep, but adrenaline and vindication were better than caffeine for keeping me alert. My phone hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn, each notification bringing another opportunity, another validation, another piece of evidence that my family's assessment of my life had been spectacularly wrong. By 8 a.m., I was dressed in my best blazer, sitting at my tiny kitchen table that now served as headquarters for what legal experts were calling one of the most promising healthcare technology acquisitions of the year. My laptop screen displayed 3 different video calls simultaneously: lawyers in Manhattan, venture capitalists in Palo Alto, and medical researchers in Baltimore, all competing for my attention. The transformation was dizzying. 24 hours ago, I'd been the family failure begging for scraps of respect. Now I was fielding calls from people who treated my time like it was worth more per minute than most people made in a week. Sarah, Amanda Chen from Hartfield Morrison was saying through my laptop speakers, her voice crisp with the authority of someone who brokered deals that moved markets. Meridian has increased their initial offer to $18 million, but honestly, I think we can do better. The Goldman Sachs preliminary assessment suggests we're looking at a floor of 25 million, with upside potential significantly higher. $25 million. The number felt abstract, like play money from a board game rather than real compensation for the work I'd done in my pajamas at 2 a.m., debugging code while eating cold pizza and wondering if I was delusional. "What's the timeline looking like?" I asked, trying to sound like someone who regularly negotiated 8-figure deals instead of someone who'd been researching how to respond to acquisition offers on Google for the past 3 hours. "That's where things get interesting," Amanda replied. "Normally, due diligence for an acquisition this size would take months. But the clinical data from Stanford and Johns Hopkins is so compelling that everyone wants to move fast. Plus, there's chatter that the Federal Health Modernization Initiative is going to announce major funding for exactly this type of technology. First movers are going to have enormous advantages. The Federal Health Modernization Initiative. I'd read about it in healthcare policy journals, but I'd never imagined my little platform would be significant enough to benefit from it. The scope of what was happening was expanding faster than I could process. My phone rang, interrupting the video call. Marcus, my brother who'd spent yesterday evening investigating my business so he could humiliate me more effectively, was now calling at 8:15 a.m. on Black Friday. The irony was almost too perfect. "Amanda, can I call you back in 10 minutes? Something urgent just came up." I answered Marcus's call with a calmness I didn't feel. "Hello, Marcus." "Sarah, thank God. I've been trying to reach you since last night." His voice had a quality I'd never heard before. Uncertainty mixed with what might have been panic. "There's been some kind of misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding about what?" "About your business. I got a call this morning from my friend. In tech? The one who looked into your platform? He said there's been some major development, something about acquisition talks and clinical trials. He wanted to know if you were really my sister because apparently you're all over healthcare industry news this morning." I could hear the confusion in his voice, the struggle to reconcile the failure he'd mocked yesterday with whatever headlines he'd been reading. Part of me wanted to end his confusion immediately, to explain exactly how wrong he'd been. But a larger part of me was curious to see how this would play out. "I'm not sure what you mean," I said, my voice neutral. "Sarah, don't play games. Are you involved in some kind of major business deal? Because there are articles about healthcare AI and government partnerships, and your name keeps coming up. Healthcare AI and government partnerships." The news was traveling faster than I'd expected. Of course, Marcus would have Google alerts set up for anything related to tech acquisitions. He probably used insider information to make investment decisions, though he'd never admit it. "There might be some business developments," I said carefully. "Why do you ask?" "Because—" He paused, and I could practically hear him recalculating every assumption he'd made about my life. "Because Mom and Dad are freaking out. Mom saw something on LinkedIn about you being featured in Healthcare Innovation Weekly, and Dad got a call from his golf partner asking about his daughter, the healthcare tech entrepreneur. They had no idea you were involved in anything significant." Of course they hadn't. They'd been so busy dismissing my work that they'd never bothered to actually research what I was doing. Their information came from their assumptions, not from any genuine interest in my life. "I tried to tell you yesterday that things were developing," I said, allowing just a hint of satisfaction to creep into my voice. "But you seemed more interested in investigating my user numbers than listening to what I was actually saying." The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of everything he couldn't take back, every cutting word that now sounded like evidence of his own ignorance rather than my failure. "Sarah, I think we need to talk. As a family. There might have been some miscommunication yesterday." Miscommunication? The classic family euphemism for, we were completely wrong, but we're not emotionally capable of admitting it directly. "I'm actually quite busy today," I said, which was true, but also strategically satisfying. "I have calls with lawyers and investors all morning." "Lawyers and investors?" Marcus's voice cracked slightly. "Sarah, Exactly what kind of deal are we talking about here? We. As if he'd been part of my journey instead of actively working to undermine it. As if his investigation and humiliation yesterday had been supportive rather than destructive. The I. Kind that probably wouldn't interest you, I said. After all, it's just my little hobby that's preventing me from getting a real job. Sarah, come on. Don't be like this. Don't be like what? Successful? Because that seems to be the one thing that really bothers you about me. My phone buzzed with another call, this one from a 415 area code. San Francisco. Probably another venture capital firm or tech company wanting to discuss partnerships. Marcus, I need to go. I have actual business to attend to. Wait, Sarah. Please. Mom wants to talk to you. She feels terrible about how things ended yesterday. Mom feels terrible. Not Mom realizes she was wrong or Mom wants to apologize for systematically attacking your character. Just feels terrible, which could mean anything from genuine remorse to social embarrassment at being caught on the wrong side of a success story. Tell Mom that I appreciate her concern, but I'm in the middle of some very complex negotiations that require my full attention. Complex negotiations. I loved how that sounded. How it transformed me from the family disappointment into someone whose time was valuable enough that even family drama had to wait in line. Negotiations for what exactly? The sale of my company, Marcus. The company you spent yesterday evening proving didn't exist. I hung up before he could respond, immediately feeling lighter. For the first time in my adult life, I'd ended a conversation with my family from a position of power rather than defensiveness. The San Francisco call was indeed from a venture capital firm, but they weren't interested in acquisition. They wanted to discuss growth capital, expansion funding that would let me keep control of NutriBridge while scaling it nationally. Ms. Mitchell, the partner was saying, what you've built has the potential to transform how we approach personalized medicine. Rather than selling to a corporate healthcare system, you might consider maintaining independence and building something that could be worth 10 times current valuations within 5 years. 10 times current valuations. If the current discussions were hovering around 25 million, that would put the potential future value at. I couldn't even process numbers that large. The weekend passed in a blur of due diligence calls, legal document reviews, and strategic planning sessions that took place in conference rooms I'd only dreamed of entering. By Sunday evening, I had 4 serious acquisition offers ranging from $18 to $37 million, 3 different venture capital firms competing to lead expansion funding, and a meeting scheduled with the Surgeon General's office for Tuesday morning. But the most satisfying moment came Sunday night, when I received a text from my cousin Rachel. Holy shit, Sarah. You're on the front page of the Boston Globe business section. Local entrepreneur disrupts healthcare with AI innovation. Your parents' neighbors have been calling all weekend asking about you. The front page of the Boston Globe. I'd grown up reading that newspaper at the breakfast table, dreaming of someday being important enough to warrant their attention. Now, my picture was above the fold, with a headline that described me as an innovator rather than a dreamer, a disruptor rather than a failure. The article was everything I'd never dared to hope for. It described NutriBridge as revolutionary, quoted Dr. Rodriguez calling my work paradigm shifting, and included a photo of me in my tiny apartment with the caption, Mitchell works from her Jamaica Plain home office, having bootstrapped her company from savings while major investors overlooked its potential. Having bootstrapped her company from savings while major investors overlooked its potential. The journalist had managed to frame my financial struggles as evidence of vision and determination, rather than poor planning and unrealistic expectations. But the best part of the article was a quote from Dr. Rodriguez that put everything in perspective. What makes Mitchell's platform so remarkable isn't just the technology. It's the understanding that healthcare is fundamentally personal. She's solved problems that major corporations with unlimited resources couldn't solve because she approached it from the patient's perspective rather than the profit perspective. She approached it from the patient's perspective, rather than the profit perspective. That single sentence captured exactly why I'd been willing to sacrifice comfort and security for something that mattered more than money. By Monday morning, my phone was ringing before my alarm went off. But this time, it wasn't lawyers or investors. It was my mother, calling at 6:47 a.m. with the kind of urgency usually reserved for family emergencies. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message while making coffee in the kitchen that had become the nerve center of a multi-million-dollar business negotiation. "Sarah, honey, it's Mom. I know you're probably very busy with everything that's happening, but we really need to talk. As a family. There are some things we need to clear up about Thursday night and, well, there are some opportunities we think you should consider. Please call me back. This is important. Opportunities we think you should consider." The audacity was breathtaking. After spending Thursday evening systematically destroying my confidence and questioning my judgment, they now wanted to offer guidance on opportunities they'd had no role in creating. I deleted the voicemail and turned my attention to the contract amendments that Amanda Chen had sent over for review. I had a phone call with the Goldman Sachs team in an hour, followed by a technical presentation to the Meridian Board of Directors at 2 p.m. For the first time in my adult life, my family would have to wait in line, because I finally had more important things to do than manage their emotions about my success. Tuesday morning brought the kind of crisp December air that made Boston feel electric with possibility. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, adjusting the navy blazer I'd bought specifically for my meeting with the Surgeon General's office, and marveled at how much had changed in less than a week. The woman looking back at me bore little resemblance to the defeated daughter who'd fled Thanksgiving dinner in tears. My phone buzzed with a text from Amanda Chen. "Meridian has countered at $32 million with accelerated closing. Goldman wants to present their growth capital proposal this afternoon. You're going to have some interesting decisions to make. $32 million. The number still felt surreal, like something that happened to other people in news articles rather than to someone who'd been eating instant noodles for dinner just a week ago. But the validation was almost more valuable than the money. Proof that everything I'd sacrificed had been worthwhile. As I was gathering my notes for the Washington meeting, my doorbell rang. Not the buzzer from the building entrance, but my actual apartment door. I frowned, checking my phone to see if I'd missed a delivery notification, but found something much more unexpected. A text from Marcus sent 3 minutes earlier. "I'm outside your building. We need to talk before you make any major decisions." The audacity took my breath away. He'd driven from Westchester to Boston without asking, without warning, apparently assuming that his sudden interest in my welfare gave him the right to interrupt the most important week of my professional life. I opened the door to find not just Marcus, but my father as well, both wearing expressions of forced concern that barely masked their desperation. They'd clearly coordinated this ambush, probably spent the drive rehearsing how they'd position themselves as caring family members, rather than the people who'd spent Thursday night systematically destroying my confidence. "Sarah, thank God," my father said, moving as if to embrace me before thinking better of it. "We've been so worried about you. Worried about me. As if my success was somehow dangerous. As if the validation I'd spent years working toward was a crisis they needed to manage." "Worried about what exactly?" I asked, not inviting them in, keeping my hand on the doorframe in a way that made it clear this wasn't a social visit. "About these deals you're considering," Marcus said, shifting his weight like he was preparing for a difficult negotiation. "Sarah, these are complex financial transactions. You need experienced guidance to make sure you're not being taken advantage of. Being taken advantage of." The irony was so thick I could taste it. The same brother who'd investigated my business so he could humiliate me more effectively was now positioning himself as my protector against exploitation. "I have lawyers, Marcus, very good ones, and financial advisors, and business consultants. I think I'm covered. But they don't know you like we do. my father interjected. They don't have your best interests at heart like family does. Like family does. The same family that had spent Thursday evening telling me I was delusional, irresponsible, and incapable of understanding how the real world worked. The same family that had suggested I give up on my dreams and settle for a teaching job because I wasn't leadership material. Interesting, I said, checking my watch with deliberate obviousness. Because on Thursday, you seemed pretty convinced that I was throwing my life away on a fantasy. What changed? They exchanged glances, the kind of silent communication that happens between people who've been planning their approach carefully, but hadn't anticipated this level of directness. Sarah, we were concerned about you, my father said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone that had defined my childhood. We saw you struggling, pouring all your resources into something that seemed uncertain. We wanted to protect you from disappointment. Protect me from disappointment by ensuring I was disappointed in myself before anyone else could be, by systematically dismantling my confidence so thoroughly that I'd give up before I could fail publicly and embarrass them. And now? I asked. Now? We can see that maybe we didn't have all the information, Marcus said carefully. Maybe the situation is more developed than we realized. More developed than we realized. Not, we were wrong. Not, we underestimated you. Not, we're sorry. For spending an entire evening attacking everything you care about. Just that they'd been working with incomplete information, as if their cruelty had been a reasonable response to what they knew at the time. The situation, I repeated. Is that what we're calling my life's work now? Sarah, don't be difficult, my father said. And there it was, the flash of irritation that revealed what this visit was really about. They weren't here to apologize or reconcile. They were here to regain control of a narrative that had spun beyond their management. I'm not being difficult. I'm being successful, which, according to Thursday's conversation, was supposed to be impossible. My phone rang, the caller ID showing the DC number I'd been expecting. The Surgeon General's office, calling to confirm our meeting and go over the agenda. I need to take this, I said, not moving to let them inside. It's the federal government. I answered the call with my family standing awkwardly in my hallway, listening to me discuss healthcare policy implementation and national rollout strategies with officials who treated my expertise as valuable rather than questionable. Yes, Dr. Martinez, I have the preliminary implementation framework ready for review, I said, watching my father's eyes widen as he realized the scope of what I was discussing. The scalability analysis suggests we could be looking at nationwide deployment within 18 months if the pilot programs show similar results to Stanford and Johns Hopkins. When I hung up, both men were staring at me with expressions I'd never seen before. A mixture of awe, confusion, and something that might have been fear. The Surgeon General's office, my father said slowly. They're discussing national deployment of your platform. Among other things, yes. Jesus, Sarah, Marcus breathed. How long has this been developing? About 3 years, I said. The same 3 years you've been telling me to give up and get a real job. The silence stretched between us, heavy with implications they were finally beginning to understand. This wasn't a lucky break or a sudden development. This was the culmination of everything they'd dismissed as worthless dreaming. Look, Marcus said, switching to what I recognized as his lawyer voice. I know Thursday got a little heated. Family dinners. You know how they are. But we're here now because we want to help. Want to help. The phrase that launched 1,000 family interventions, usually code for want to control the situation before it gets beyond our influence. Help with what? With managing all this, my father said, gesturing vaguely at my apartment, as if my success was contained within these walls. These are life-changing decisions, Sarah. You need people you can trust to help you navigate them. People you can trust. The same people who'd spent Thursday evening proving that I couldn't trust them with my dreams, my feelings, or my basic dignity. I appreciate the offer, I said, my voice carefully neutral. But I have a team of advisors already. People who understood the value of what I was building before it became obvious to everyone else. But we're family, my father said. And for the first time I heard genuine uncertainty in his voice. That has to count for something. Family. The word they'd used as a weapon on Thursday, questioning my loyalty because I wouldn't accept their definition of reasonable ambition. Now they wanted to use it as a shield, protecting them from the consequences of their own words. It does count for something, I said. It counts for Thursday night. It counts for 3 years of being told I was delusional. It counts for every family gathering where you treated my work like an embarrassing hobby you were too polite to directly mock. Sarah, Marcus started, but I held up my hand. I have a meeting with the Surgeon General in 4 hours. I have acquisition offers on the table that will change my life. I have the opportunity to build something that could help millions of people. And you want to spend today relitigating Thursday's conversation as if you can retroactively transform your mockery into support. We weren't mocking you, my father protested. You handed me a takeout menu joke and laughed about my failure with prime rib on your plates. You investigated my business so you could humiliate me more effectively. You spent 4 hours systematically dismantling my confidence and then acted surprised when I left. The words hung in the air between us, each one a small truth they couldn't deny or explain away. We were trying to help you see reality, Marcus said quietly. Whose reality? I asked. Because my reality includes phone calls from the federal government, acquisition offers from Fortune 500 companies, and clinical trials showing that my work is helping people in ways you never bothered to understand. My phone buzzed with another text from Amanda Chen. Sarah, need to discuss timeline. Multiple parties are pushing for decisions this week. Can you call when convenient? I need to go, I said, checking my watch again. I have a flight to catch and decisions to make that will affect thousands of jobs and millions of patients. Sarah, wait, my father said, his voice carrying a note of panic I'd never heard before. We need to work this out, as a family. We are working it out, I said. I'm setting boundaries. The same boundaries you forced me to create when you made it clear that my dreams weren't welcome at your table. Don't let pride ruin your family relationships, Marcus said, and I almost laughed at the irony. This isn't about pride. This is about respect. And respect is earned through actions, not demanded through DNA. I stepped back into my apartment and began closing the door, but my father put his hand against it. Sarah, please. Your mother is beside herself. She feels terrible. About Thursday. Then she should have thought about that before she spent the evening questioning my judgment, my capabilities, and my understanding of reality. She wants to make things right. Making things right would require acknowledging that you were all completely wrong about everything. Are you prepared to do that? The question hung between us like a challenge they couldn't meet. Because acknowledging they were wrong would mean admitting that their certainty about my limitations had been unfounded, that their protective concern had been controlling manipulation, that their practical advice had been fear disguised as wisdom. It's complicated, my father said finally. No, it's not, I replied. It's actually very simple. You either respect me as an adult capable of making my own decisions, or you don't. Thursday night, you made your position clear. I closed the door gently but firmly, leaving them standing in my hallway while I gathered my briefcase and prepared for a meeting that would validate every risk I'd taken, every sacrifice I'd made, every moment when I'd chosen to believe in myself despite their doubts. As I called for a ride to the airport, I could hear them talking in hushed voices outside my door. 2 powerful men who'd built successful careers. By controlling situations and managing outcomes, suddenly faced with a daughter who no longer needed their permission to succeed. The beautiful irony was that they'd created this situation themselves. By pushing me away from their table, they'd forced me to build my own. And now that my table was bigger and more successful than theirs, they wanted to be invited to sit down. But some invitations, once rescinded, can't be restored by simply changing your mind about the value of the guest. The Surgeon General's office occupied an entire floor of a gleaming federal building in Washington, D.C., its walls lined with portraits of medical pioneers who'd shaped American healthcare policy. As I sat in the reception area, waiting for a meeting I'd never dreamed possible, I couldn't help but think about the conversation with my father and Marcus just hours earlier. They'd positioned themselves as protectors concerned about my inexperience with high-stakes negotiations. But sitting here, reviewing briefing documents that discussed nationwide implementation of my platform, I realized how fundamentally they'd misunderstood both me and what I'd built. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about the chance to transform healthcare for millions of people who'd been failed by one-size-fits-all solutions. Ms. Mitchell? A woman in a crisp suit appeared at my side. Dr. Martinez is ready for you. The Surgeon General's office was exactly what you'd expect from the nation's top medical official. Diplomas and awards covering every wall, medical journals stacked on every surface, and an energy that suggested important decisions were made here daily. Dr. Maria Martinez herself was smaller than she appeared in photographs, but her presence filled the room with the kind of authority that comes from decades of saving lives and shaping policy. Sarah, she said, rising from behind a desk covered with clinical studies and policy briefs. I've been following your work since Dr. Rodriguez first brought it to my attention. What you've accomplished is extraordinary. Extraordinary. Not promising, not interesting, not potentially valuable. Extraordinary. Coming from the Surgeon General, the word carried weight that made my chest tight with pride and responsibility. Thank you, Dr. Martinez. Though I have to admit, 6 months ago I never imagined I'd be sitting in this office. She laughed, a warm sound that put me immediately at ease. 6 months ago, I never imagined we'd have clinical data showing the kind of results your platform is producing. The Stanford and Johns Hopkins trials aren't just impressive, they're paradigm-shifting. We spent the next hour diving deep into the technical aspects of NutriBridge, discussing implementation challenges, regulatory pathways, and the potential for integration with existing federal health programs. Dr. Martinez asked questions that revealed a profound understanding of both the technology and its implications for public health policy. What intrigues me most, she said as our meeting neared its end, is that you approached this from the patient perspective rather than the institutional perspective. Most healthcare technology is designed to make systems more efficient. Yours, it's designed to make patients healthier. That was always the goal, I said. I watched too many people struggle with generic advice that didn't account for their individual circumstances, their cultural backgrounds, their economic realities. Healthcare should be personal. It should be, she agreed. And if our preliminary analysis is correct, your platform could reduce healthcare costs by billions while improving outcomes for millions. That's not just good business, it's good public policy. She leaned forward, her expression becoming more serious. Sarah, I want to be direct with you. The federal government is prepared to make a significant investment in scaling your platform nationally. We're talking about a partnership that would make your technology available to every American who needs it, starting with our most vulnerable populations. A partnership with the federal government. The scope was staggering, beyond anything I'd imagined when I first started coding in my apartment 3 years ago. What would that look like practically? I asked. Full development funding, regulatory fast-tracking, integration with Medicare and Medicaid, deployment through VA hospitals and community health centers. We're looking at a 5-year rollout that could reach 15 million patients in Phase 1 alone. 15 million patients, each one a person like Maria Santos or David Chen, someone who'd been struggling with health challenges that traditional medicine hadn't fully addressed. The opportunity to help that many people was both thrilling and terrifying. I need to ask, Dr. Martinez continued, what your current situation is with private sector interest. I understand there are acquisition discussions happening. The question I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. There are several offers on the table, I said carefully. Significant ones. I imagine so. And I want you to know that we're not asking you to choose between profit and purpose. But I do want you to understand the full scope of what we're offering. She slid a folder across her desk, thick with documents that would require careful review with my legal team. But the summary sheet on top made my hands shake as I read it. The federal partnership would provide immediate funding of $40 million for development and implementation, with performance bonuses that could bring the total to over $100 million across 5 years. But more importantly, it would give NutriBridge a platform to reach patients who needed it most, not just those who could afford private health care. I started, then stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered. This is your chance to change American healthcare, Dr. Martinez said. Not just for the patients who can afford innovation, but for everyone. The flight back to Boston gave me 3 hours to process what had just happened. The federal government wanted to make my platform a cornerstone of national healthcare policy. The private sector wanted to buy my company for enough money to solve every financial worry I'd ever had. And my family, who'd spent Thursday evening convinced I was delusional, was probably at home trying to figure out how to position themselves as supportive of my success. By the time I landed at Logan Airport, I'd made my decision. I called Amanda Chen from the taxi ride home. Amanda, I need to set up calls with all the acquisition suitors. I have an announcement to make. Good news or bad news? She asked. Depends on your perspective, I said. I'm taking the federal partnership. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Sarah, Amanda said finally, the Meridian offer is $32 million. Goldman is talking about growth capital that could value the company at over $100 million in 3 years. Are you sure you want to walk away from that? I'm not walking away from anything, I said. I'm walking toward something bigger. That evening, I called each of the companies that had made acquisition offers, personally thanking them for their interest while explaining my decision to partner with the federal government instead. The responses ranged from disappointed to incredulous to respectfully admiring. The call with Meridian's CEO was particularly memorable. Ms. Mitchell, he said, I respect your decision, but I have to ask, are you sure you understand what you're turning down? This could be generational wealth. I understand, I said, but I didn't build this platform to create generational wealth. I built it to help people who've been overlooked by the healthcare system. The federal partnership lets me do that at a scale that private acquisition never could. You're either very principled or very naive, he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't sure which. Maybe both, I admitted. But I can live with that. After I finished the last call, I sat in my apartment looking at the city lights through my windows, feeling a sense of completion I'd never experienced before. I'd turned down enough money to buy my parents' house 10 times over, and I felt lighter than I had in years. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Sarah, we need to talk. There are family financial matters you should be aware of before you make any irreversible decisions. Family financial matters. The phrase sent a chill down my spine because I knew my mother well enough to recognize manipulation disguised as concern. What family financial matters could possibly be relevant to my business decisions? I called Rachel instead. Can you talk? I asked when she picked up. Always. What's going on? My mom just texted something about family financial matters I should know about before making irreversible decisions. Any idea what that means? Rachel was quiet for a moment. Oh, Sarah. You don't know, do you? Know what? About the trust fund. About what your parents have been planning. My stomach dropped. What about the trust fund? They've been talking to lawyers about restructuring it. Something about ensuring that family assets are protected if any of their children make poor financial decisions. They started the process after your last family dinner, when they decided you were being irresponsible with your inheritance. The room spun around me. They're trying to take away my trust fund? Not take away, exactly, but put conditions on it. Requirements that major financial decisions be approved by the family, that you demonstrate fiscal responsibility before accessing the principal. I sat down heavily on my couch, the irony hitting me like a physical blow. While I was turning down acquisition offers worth tens of millions of dollars, my family was trying to restrict my access to money I'd never asked for and didn't need. Sarah? Rachel's voice sounded far away. Are you okay? I'm perfect, I said, and for the first time all week, I meant it completely. I'm absolutely perfect. Because in that moment, I realized that my family had just given me the greatest gift possible, complete freedom from any obligation to include them in my success. They'd been so convinced of my incompetence that they'd tried to legally restrict my financial independence at the exact moment I was achieving more success than any of them had ever imagined. The trust fund they were trying to control was worth about $3 million, less than a tenth of what I'd just turned down to pursue something I believed in more than money. Rachel, I said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course. Do you think I'm making a mistake? Choosing the federal partnership over the private acquisition offers? She was quiet for a long moment. I think, she said finally, that you're the first person in our family to choose purpose over profit, and I think that terrifies them because it means they can't predict or control what you'll do next. Purpose over profit. That phrase crystallized everything I'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. I hadn't turned down the acquisition offers because I didn't understand their value. I'd turned them down because I understood the value of something more important. That night, I drafted an email to my parents and Marcus. Not an angry rant or an emotional plea, but a clear, professional explanation of my decisions and my boundaries. I'm writing to inform you that I've accepted a partnership with the federal government to scale NutriBridge as part of the National Healthcare Modernization Initiative. This decision aligns with my values and my vision for the platform's impact. I'm also writing to let you know that I'm aware of your plans regarding the Family Trust Fund. Please proceed with whatever restrictions you feel are necessary. I neither need nor want access to family money at this point in my life. Finally, I want to be clear about my boundaries going forward. I'm willing to have a relationship with you, but only if it's based on mutual respect rather than your approval of my choices. Thursday's dinner made it clear that your love is conditional on my conformity to your expectations. I'm no longer willing to pretend that's healthy for any of us. I hope you can understand that this isn't about anger or revenge. It's about building a life that aligns with my values, even when those values are different from yours. I sent the email at 11:47 p.m. and turned off my phone. For the first time in my adult life, I went to sleep knowing that I'd chosen my own path without asking permission from anyone. And for the first time in years, I slept through the night without waking up worried about what other people thought of my decisions. The next morning, I would start building something bigger than my family had ever imagined possible. But tonight, I was finally free. 6 months later, I stood in the East Room of the White House, watching the president sign the Healthcare Innovation Act into law. NutriBridge had become the flagship program of the Federal Health Modernization Initiative, and I was about to witness my platform become part of American healthcare policy. The journey from my tiny apartment to this moment had been surreal. The federal partnership had moved faster than anyone anticipated, driven by clinical results that exceeded every projection. The pilot programs across 12 states had shown reduction in healthcare costs of up to 40% while improving patient outcomes. Across every metric measured, Sarah, Dr. Martinez appeared at my elbow, her voice barely containing her excitement. When the president starts speaking, you're going to hear some numbers that might surprise you. She was right. When the president began outlining the impact of the Healthcare Innovation Act, the statistics were staggering. NutriBridge was now serving 2.3 million patients across 47 states. The platform had reduced emergency room visits by 35%, cut medication costs by 28%, and improved quality of life scores by an average of 67% among users with chronic conditions. But the number that made my throat tight with emotion was the last one. This innovative platform has created over 15,000 jobs in communities across America, from software developers to nutritionists to community health coordinators. 15,000 jobs. I thought about my family's concern that I wasn't contributing to the real economy, that I was wasting my potential on something that would never create lasting value. Now my platform was supporting more families than lived in the town where I grew up. After the ceremony, I found myself in a reception room filled with healthcare leaders, policymakers, and journalists. The conversations swirling around me felt like something from a dream. Discussions of my work with the same reverence usually reserved for established medical institutions. Ms. Mitchell, a reporter from the Washington Post, approached me with, "A digital recorder. Can you tell us about your background? How does someone go from unknown entrepreneur to transforming American healthcare policy?" I thought about how to answer that question truthfully without turning it into a family drama. I think it started with recognizing that healthcare is fundamentally personal, I said. The one-size-fits-all approach wasn't working for millions of people, and I had the technical background to build something better. But you bootstrapped this from your apartment, correct? No venture capital, no institutional support initially. That's right. Sometimes the best innovations come from people who are close enough to the problem to understand it personally, but far enough outside the system to imagine different solutions. What I didn't mention was that my family's dismissal had actually been a gift. If they'd been supportive from the beginning, I might have taken safer paths, sought their approval. For each decision, let their caution limit my vision. Their rejection had forced me to develop an independent compass that pointed toward impact rather than approval. The reception lasted for 3 hours, filled with conversations that would have seemed impossible just a year ago. I exchanged information with researchers from around the world who wanted to adapt NutriBridge for their healthcare systems. I discussed potential collaborations with tech leaders who understood the platform's significance. But the most meaningful conversation came near the end of the evening, when Dr. Rodriguez approached me with tears in her eyes. "Sarah, I need to tell you something," she said, pulling me aside from the crowd. "Remember Maria Santos, one of your early users from Phoenix?" I nodded. Maria had been one of my first success stories, the woman whose rheumatoid arthritis had improved so dramatically that she'd been able to hike with her grandchildren. "She passed away last month," Dr. Rodriguez continued, and my heart sank. But not from her arthritis. She had a heart attack, completely unrelated. But Sarah, at her funeral, her daughter told me that the last 2 years of Maria's life were the best she'd had in a decade. Because of your platform, she got to be the grandmother she'd always wanted to be. The words hit me like a physical force. Maria Santos had lived better because of something I'd built in my apartment while eating ramen noodles and wondering if I was delusional. "Her daughter wanted me to give you this," Dr. Rodriguez said, handing me a small envelope. Inside was a photo of Maria hiking with 3 young children, all of them grinning at the camera against a backdrop of desert mountains. On the back, in careful handwriting, "For Sarah, thank you for giving me my life back. Maria Santos, 2024. I excused myself to the bathroom and cried for 10 minutes, overwhelmed by the reminder of why I'd chosen this path over acquisition, offers that would have made me wealthy, but not necessarily meaningful. The flight back to Boston gave me time to process everything that had happened. In the span of 6 months, I'd gone from family pariah to White House guest. My platform was now serving millions of people, supported by federal funding that ensured its sustainability for decades to come. But perhaps most importantly, I'd learned. to measure success by my own standards rather than other people's expectations. My phone had been buzzing intermittently during the flight. Congratulatory messages from colleagues, interview requests from journalists, partnership proposals from international healthcare systems. But one message stood out among all the professional communications. It was from Marcus. "Sarah, I saw the White House ceremony on C-SPAN. I need to apologize. We all do. Can we talk?" I stared at the message for a long time, feeling a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let the silence stretch until it became permanent. But another part of me, the part that remembered building snowmen with Marcus when we were kids, wondered if reconciliation was possible. I called Rachel first. "Did you see the ceremony?" I asked. "Of course I did." "Sarah, I'm so proud of you. I can barely stand it. You were incredible up there," Marcus texted. "He wants to apologize. How do you feel about that?" I thought for a moment. Complicated. I'm not angry anymore. But I'm also not the same person who desperately wanted their approval. "What do you think you'll do?" "I think I'll listen to what he has to say. But on my terms, not theirs." That weekend, I agreed to meet Marcus at a coffee shop in Cambridge, neutral territory where neither of us had the home field advantage. He arrived 10 minutes early, looking uncomfortable in a way I'd never seen before. "Sarah," he said as I sat down across from him, "I owe you the biggest apology of my life." I waited, curious to see how he would frame what had happened between us. "I was wrong about everything," he continued. "Your business, your potential, your judgment. I was so convinced that I understood how the world worked that I couldn't see what you were actually building." "What changed your mind?" I asked. "Honestly, the numbers. When I realized what you'd turned down to take the federal partnership, I finally understood that you weren't naive about business. You were thinking about business differently than I was." The numbers. Of course, that's what had convinced him. Not the patient testimonials or the clinical results or the impact on people's lives, but the financial implications he'd finally grasped. "Marcus, I appreciate the apology, but I need you to understand something. I'm not the same person who left Thanksgiving dinner in tears. I don't need your approval anymore." "I know," he said quietly. "And honestly, that's what I respect most about what you've done. You didn't just prove us wrong about your business. You proved us wrong about who you are." We talked for 2 hours, covering everything from that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner to the White House ceremony. Marcus admitted that the family's attempt to restrict my trust fund had been his idea, born from genuine concern about my financial decisions, but executed with typical family paternalism. "The irony," he said, "is that we were trying to protect you from making mistakes, and the whole time you were building something more valuable than any of us had ever achieved." By the end of our conversation, I realized that forgiveness wasn't about absolving him of what he'd done. It was about freeing myself from the weight of carrying anger I no longer needed. "I forgive you," I told him as we prepared to leave. "But things can't go back to the way they were. I can't go back to being the family member who needs permission to dream big." "I wouldn't want you to," he said. "The world needs more people like you, not fewer." Over the following months, I slowly rebuilt relationships with my family, but on fundamentally different terms. My mother and father eventually offered their own apologies, though theirs came with more conditions and explanations than Marcus's had. The family dynamics had shifted permanently. I was no longer the daughter seeking approval. I was the family member whose judgment they now sought on important decisions. The reversal was sometimes uncomfortable, but it was honest in a way our previous relationships had never been. 1. Year after that devastating Thanksgiving dinner, I hosted my own celebration. Not a traditional holiday gathering, but a dinner for the people who'd supported my vision when it was still just an idea. Dr. Rodriguez flew in from Stanford. Rachel drove up from Connecticut. Amanda Chen came from New York with her family. My development team from Boston joined us, along with several patients whose lives had been transformed by the platform. We gathered in the dining room of the house I'd bought in Beacon Hill, not because I needed the space, but because I wanted to prove to myself that I could create the kind of home where people felt valued for who they were rather than who they were expected to be. As we sat around the table, sharing stories and expressing gratitude, I realized that this was what family actually looked like. Not people bound by blood who demanded conformity, but people connected by choice who celebrated each other's growth. Maria Santos's daughter had flown in from Phoenix for the dinner, bringing the original photo her mother had sent me. We displayed it on the mantelpiece next to updates from hundreds of other patients whose lives had been improved by personalized healthcare. "You know what I'm most grateful for?" Rachel asked as we shared dessert. "What's that?" "That you didn't listen to us. That you were stubborn enough to keep building something you believed in even when everyone around you thought you were crazy." Looked around the table at the faces of people who'd seen my potential before it was obvious, who'd supported my vision when it was still fragile, who'd chosen to be part of my journey rather than demanding I follow theirs. "I'm grateful too," I said, "for learning that sometimes the best thing your family can do for you is force you to discover what you're really capable of on your own." The conversation continued late into the evening, filled with laughter and planning and the kind of connection that comes from being authentically yourself with people who appreciate that authenticity. As I cleaned up afterward, I found myself thinking about that moment at my parents' Thanksgiving table when they'd handed me a takeout menu while everyone else shared a feast. At the time, it had felt like the ultimate rejection, proof that I didn't belong at their table. Now I understood it differently. They hadn't excluded me from their feast. They'd freed me to create my own. And the table I'd built was more nourishing than anything they could have offered me. Sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is the motivation to prove them wrong. My family had given me that gift, and I'd used it to build something bigger than any of us had imagined possible. The platform that started as a rejected dream was now serving millions of people, creating thousands of jobs, and reshaping American healthcare policy. But more importantly, it had taught me that success isn't about earning other people's approval. It's about having the courage to pursue your own vision of what's possible. And sometimes, when you stop asking for a seat at someone else's table, you realize you've been capable of building your own restaurant all along. 2 years after that life-changing Thanksgiving, I found myself standing in the auditorium at MIT, preparing to deliver the keynote address for their annual Healthcare Innovation Summit. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same institution where my father had once suggested I should have studied something more practical was now inviting me to speak about revolutionizing American healthcare. The audience was filled with the kind of people I'd once dreamed of impressing: venture capitalists, medical researchers, policymakers, and young entrepreneurs who reminded me of myself 3 years ago. Passionate, determined, and probably doubting whether their crazy ideas could actually change the world. When I started building NutriBridge in my studio apartment, I began, looking out at the sea of faces. My biggest fear wasn't that I would fail. It was that I would succeed just enough to prove my family right about my limitations. A ripple of knowing laughter went through the audience. These were people who understood the weight of other people's expectations, the pressure to choose, safety over significance. But I learned something important during those early years of building my platform, while everyone around me questioned my judgment. The people who love you most can sometimes be the ones who limit you most, not out of malice, but out of their own fears about what's possible. I clicked to the first slide of my presentation, showing the current statistics from NutriBridge's national implementation. The numbers still felt surreal: 4.7 million active users, 67% average improvement in health outcomes, $2.8 billion in healthcare cost savings, and 23,000 jobs created across all 50 states. But the most important number isn't on this slide, I continued. It's the number of people who've been able to live fuller, healthier lives because someone believed that technology could be used to serve patients rather than just institutions. The presentation went on for 45 minutes, covering the technical innovations, policy implications, and economic impact of personalized healthcare at scale. But the questions afterward revealed what the audience really wanted to understand: how someone goes from being dismissed by their own family to transforming an entire industry. Ms. Mitchell, a young woman in the front row, raised her hand. How did you maintain confidence in your vision when the people closest to you didn't believe in it? The question hit closer to home than she probably realized. I had to learn the difference between self-doubt and healthy skepticism, I said. Self-doubt tells you that you're not capable of achieving your goals. Healthy skepticism asks whether your goals are worth achieving and whether your approach is sound. When everyone around you is expressing doubt, you have to figure out which category their concerns fall into. But what if they're right? Another audience member asked. What if the people who know you best are trying to protect you from failure? I thought about my parents, who'd spent that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner, convinced they were saving me from embarrassment and financial ruin. Their concern had been genuine, even if their approach had been devastating. Sometimes the people who know you best know the version of you that exists within their limitations, I said. They can't imagine you succeeding because they've never seen you operate outside their definition of what's possible. That doesn't make them malicious. It makes them human. After the presentation, I was approached by dozens of entrepreneurs, researchers, and students who wanted to share their own stories of family doubt and personal transformation. The conversations reminded me that my experience wasn't unique. Almost everyone who'd ever built something meaningful had faced skepticism from people they loved. But one conversation stood out. A graduate student named Elena approached me. During the reception, her laptop bag covered with stickers from healthcare startups and coding boot camps. Ms. Mitchell, I hope this isn't too personal, but my family had almost the exact same reaction to my business idea that yours did. They keep telling me to get a real job and stop wasting my potential on something that might not work. I looked at Elena, young, passionate, clearly brilliant, and saw myself 3 years ago. What are you building? I asked. A platform that uses AI to help elderly patients manage multiple medications safely. The drug interaction problems in that population are killing people, but the solutions are all focused on institutional compliance rather than individual needs. Her eyes lit up as she described her vision, the same way mine probably had when I'd tried to explain NutriBridge to my family. I could see the depth of her understanding, the elegance of her approach, and the potential impact of her work. Elena, I said, can I give you some advice that I wish someone had given me? She nodded eagerly. Don't waste energy trying to convince people who've already decided you're going to fail. Spend that energy proving to yourself that you're going to succeed. The validation you're seeking from your family will come, but only after you've stopped needing it. But how do you deal with the loneliness, with feeling like you're the only person who believes in what you're doing? The question brought back memories of those long nights in my apartment, debugging code while my family slept peacefully, in their certainty that I was wasting my life. You find your people, I said. They might not be your biological family, but they're the people who see your potential before it's obvious. And when you succeed, you build a table big enough for everyone who supported you when support actually mattered. Elena and I exchanged contact information, and I made a mental note to follow up with her in a few weeks. Mentoring young entrepreneurs had become one of the unexpected joys of my success. The chance to be for someone else what I'd wished I'd had during my darkest moments of doubt. The drive back to Boston gave me time to reflect on how much had changed since that devastating Thanksgiving dinner. My relationship with my family had stabilized into something healthier than it had ever been, built on mutual respect rather than conditional approval. My parents had eventually come to understand that their daughter's success wasn't a fluke or a lucky break, but the result of vision, persistence, and skills they'd never bothered to recognize. They'd learned to ask about my work with genuine interest rather than thinly veiled concern about my life choices. Marcus had become one of my strongest advocates, using his legal connections to help other healthcare entrepreneurs navigate regulatory challenges. He'd even started investing in startups founded by women and minorities, telling people that his sister had taught him to look for potential in places he'd previously overlooked. But the most profound change had been in me. I no longer measured my worth by other people's approval or defined my success by their standards. I'd learned to trust my own judgment, to value my own vision, and to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than desperate need for acceptance. That evening, I sat in my home office, the room I'd converted from a bedroom in the Beacon Hill house I'd bought with my federal partnership earnings, reviewing applications for the Sarah Mitchell Foundation. I'd established it 6 months earlier to provide funding and mentorship for entrepreneurs developing healthcare solutions for underserved communities. The applications told stories that reminded me of my own journey. Brilliant people with innovative ideas, working from small apartments and community centers, trying to solve problems that bigger institutions had ignored. People who understood that the most important innovations often come from those closest to the problems being solved. One application particularly caught my attention. A team of nurses in rural Alabama had developed a telehealth platform specifically designed for patients in areas with limited internet connectivity. Their solution was elegant, practical, and desperately needed, but they'd been turned down by traditional investors who didn't understand the market they were serving. I approved their funding request immediately, then called the lead applicant to discuss mentorship opportunities. The conversation reminded me why I'd chosen the federal partnership over private acquisition, the chance to support innovation that prioritized impact over profit margins. As I finished reviewing applications, my phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. Saw your MIT speech online. Mom and Dad watched it too. Dad actually teared up during the part about your first patient testimonials. The image of my father crying over my success felt surreal. The same man who'd once told me to be practical, to accept my limitations, to get a real job, was now moved to tears by stories of lives I'd helped save through the work he'd once dismissed as fantasy. But I realized that his tears weren't really about my success. They were about his recognition of how wrong he'd been, how close he'd come to convincing me to give up on something that mattered more than either of us had understood at the time. That night, I called my parents for our weekly check-in. It had become a ritual we'd established after rebuilding our relationship, a structured way to maintain connection without falling back into old patterns of judgment and defensiveness. "Sarah, we watched your speech today," my mother said, her voice carrying a warmth that had been absent for years before my success. "You were incredible up there." "Thank you, Mom." It felt good to share the story with people who are facing similar challenges. "Your father and I have been talking," she continued, "and we want you to know how proud we are of you. Not just for what you've achieved, but for how you achieved it. You showed a strength we didn't recognize at the time." The apology was as close as my parents would ever come to admitting they'd been fundamentally wrong about my potential. It wasn't perfect, but it was genuine, and I'd learned to appreciate progress over perfection in family relationships. "I appreciate that, Mom, and I want you to know that I understand why you were concerned. You were trying to protect me from disappointment, even if your methods weren't perfect." We talked for another 20 minutes about upcoming family events, industry developments, and the Foundation's work. The conversation was pleasant, respectful, and completely different from the dynamic that had characterized our relationship for decades. After we hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my back deck, looking out over the city lights and thinking about the journey that had brought me here. 3 years ago, I'd been a struggling entrepreneur eating ramen noodles and wondering if my family was right about my delusions of grandeur. Now I was the founder of a platform serving millions of patients, the recipient of multiple healthcare innovation awards, and someone whose opinion was sought by policymakers and industry leaders around the world. But the achievement I was most proud of wasn't professional. It was personal. I'd learned to define success on my own terms, to build relationships based on mutual respect, and to trust my own judgment even when everyone around me expressed doubt. The platform I'd built had saved lives, reduced healthcare costs, and created thousands of jobs. But more importantly, it had proven that sometimes the most meaningful innovations come from people who refuse to accept that the status quo is good enough. As I finished my wine and prepared for bed, I thought about Elena, the graduate student, who'd approached me after my speech. She reminded me that my story wasn't unique. There were countless brilliant people out there being told by well-meaning loved ones that their dreams were too big, too risky, too impractical. Some of them would listen to that advice and choose safer paths. Some would spend their lives wondering what might have been if they'd had the courage to pursue their visions despite the doubt around them. But some would do what I'd done. They'd choose their dreams over their fears, their vision over others' limitations, their potential over others' assumptions about what was possible. And those people would build the innovations that changed the world, one impossible dream at a time. The last thing I did before going to sleep was check my phone for messages from the foundation applicants I'd approved earlier. Already, 3 of them had sent thank you notes that reminded me why this work mattered more than any acquisition offer I'd ever received. "Thank you for believing in our vision when no one else would," one message read. "You've given us the chance to prove that innovation doesn't have to come from Silicon Valley or medical institutions. Sometimes it comes from people who understand problems firsthand and refuse to accept that they're unsolvable." That message perfectly captured what I'd learned from my own journey. Sometimes the people who seem least likely to succeed are the ones who understand most clearly what success actually means. And sometimes the best thing your family can do for you is give you the motivation to prove them wrong about everything they thought they knew about your potential. Because when you stop seeking approval and start seeking impact, you discover that you're capable of changing not just your own life, but the lives of millions of people you'll never meet. And that, more than any acquisition offer or family validation, is what real success looks like. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.